Evening all. It's been a week since GB News launched, and it has had very good ratings compared to other dedicated news channels, and it's also attracted a lot of criticism. Now, as expected, a lot of the criticism has come from the left in politics, but there's also been criticisms from the centre and the right as well. And I really wanted to address that in this video because I think so many of the criticisms I've heard from these political positions, I think have misunderstood what GB News is about. I think they've all made guesses, they've all made assumptions based on what they thought would happen. I'd say the criticism from the centre, I'll deal with that first, is that I've heard that it's like a television version of the Daily Mail. It really isn't. I think the closest GB News gets to being like the Daily Mail is Dan Wootton's show. Dan Wootton has come from talk radio, where he's one of these kind of on the right of politics, phone-in show, kind of saying what he thinks, kind of thing. It's a format that's as old as the hills. I mean, I remember, you get James O'Brien now, but back in the day it was James Whale and Richard Littlejohn, both of whom had subsequent television spin-offs from their phone-in radio shows. This back in the 90s and 2000s. Littlejohn and Whale had their shows, and of course they like saying things in a very loud and bombastic way in order to whip up the interest, perhaps provoke some lively debate, and that's what Wootton does on GB News. Prior to that, he was a Sun journalist. So yes, that's the closest it gets, I think. But the rest of rest of GB News, I don't think follows. It's a lot more. Its tone is quite different from the Daily Mail. It's not sort of pitched up here, with sort of the kind of shock-inducing headlines. So having dealt with that, I want to deal with the criticism from the left and from certain sections of the right, namely the criticisms it gets from the ultra-libertarian right and the neo-reactionaries. I think I'll deal with that first. Their criticism is that it's containment, the containment news network. And I think that perspective comes from two things. One is this kind of the constant need of people, many, I'm not going to say all on that, on the political, that side of the political divide. I'd say yes, probably the vast majority of neo-reactionaries. But I think with the libertarians, I don't want to tar them all with the same brush, but so I'm talking a certain section of libertarians who feel that GB News is containment. Well, what did they expect? They hadn't been reading the press briefings properly. Right from the outset, when GB News was announced that it was going to come into being, and all its press releases building up to its launch and the launch day itself explicitly stated what it was going to be and what it wasn't going to be. It wasn't going to be a British copy of Fox News. It wasn't going to be this very dry, as a cat, as usual, one of them. It was never going to be this kind of dry, ultra-conservative or even libertarian news channel. It said what it intended to do was that it was going to tackle a problem it was going to solve a problem that has long existed in British television news, which is everything comes from this kind of centre left wing starting point in British news. How do I explain that properly? Well, put it this way. There has been a site that's been operating for a few years. I don't know if it's still going actually, but it was called BBC, or Biased BBC. And it would log all the instances that it felt where the BBC was biased, ran kind of news stories like that. It's a little bit like Media Guido Fawkes. And it quoted Andrew Marr in an interview where where the BBC was accused of being biased towards the left, and Andrew Marr said something very revealing in that, and he said they don't intentionally set out to be pro-Labour or pro-left wing. It's just that the staff are almost overwhelmingly coming from a left-wing background, and so there's certain standards and assumptions that they have about their worldview, and they don't challenge that. They don't think, oh, is this too partisan? They just accept it because this to them is the standard worldview, and anything that's not coming from that perspective is somehow odd. It's the outer, it's the outlier, it's the thing they haven't considered. So what happens is that GB News came in saying, well, instead of saying, the standard television narrative, and we're talking about BBC News, we're talking about Sky, we're talking about ITN and Channel 4, they all have certain standards and assumptions, which is the EU is good, Brexit is bad, Britain has caused more problems in history than it's solved, that the metropolitan progressive worldview and globalist worldview is the standard, that's the norm, and anything that isn't coming from that is odd, it's the weird, it's the thing that needs to be questioned and exposed. So GB News comes from a different perspective. They assume, well, what if Brexit isn't necessarily a bad thing? What if the EU is fundamentally flawed? They're just taking things from a different perspective. As Andrew Neil said, they don't start off from the viewpoint everything Britain does is bad, okay, and needs to be treated with skepticism or derision. So it's not explicitly a right-wing channel. And this is the other cat, by the way, just creeping in on the side there. There's her one ear that you can see. Okay, bit camera shy. So I've had both in stereo. Anyway, I digress. So what happens is that they don't start off from the same baseline as mainstream television news. And I think that those on the right who are saying it's containment, you see, that you didn't understand what it was meant to be in the first place. A lot of people find GB News a breath of fresh air because it's coming from a different baseline perspective when it comes to the news. One of the things Andrew Neil and GB News has said is that it's going to start looking at stories that the mainstream won't cover because an issue, a hot button topic of the day will clash with the progressive left metropolitan worldview, and so it will be either played down or it won't get reported at all, and GB News will look into these things. So it was never meant to be the thing that the ultra-libertarians and the neo-reactionaries said it would be. So I think the criticism that it's containment is unfair because it's not the kind of news agency that they thought it was going to be. It's not Fox News UK. Okay, so let's just, a lot's been said about the left-wing perspective, and they just want it shut down, pure and simple. So one of the things you heard a lot during the first week, and this is what they were trying to apply pressure to on the companies to pull advertising from GB News, and that was it spreads hate. Now, what was interesting when I read so many comments, from people, I'm not just talking about a few randoms with a dozen or so Twitter followers and a string of numbers after a name and a very bland profile, obviously fake accounts. I'm talking about people who had 2,000, 3,000 followers and were clearly not fake accounts, saying that GB News is intentionally spreading hate. Now, under the current hate speech laws that we have in the United Kingdom, and with the commonly accepted categories of hate speech that will get you in trouble with the authorities, it was always on the protected characteristics. And so the challenge went out from a number of people to GB News's most vehement online critics. Well, where's the hate towards people with protected characteristics? Can you find examples? And the only things they could come back with was, again, Dan Wootton sort of saying, just having a tirade against the government's lockdown policy or COVID policy. So obviously not going after anyone or any group that had these protected characteristics, or so-called protected characteristics. It was just that his tone was angry that the June 21st Freedom Day had been postponed, delayed. So he's angry at a lot of these policies. So what the left are now saying is not that you shouldn't direct hate towards the categories of people that they pretend to want to protect. The tone, you cannot hate anything. Of course, it'd be okay for them to hate Tories, and it'd be okay for them to hate gammon. Sorry if I use a racist term there, but you cannot hate anything in there. But particularly if you're not on the progressive left, that you're not sufficiently woke enough, you're not allowed to hate. They're allowed to hate, but you're not, and it's all hugely dishonest. And what I really want to know with the campaign to pull the advertising is that it's not just a few of these Twitter loudmouths. Most of them, as I said, are fake accounts having a go at the social media accounts of these big companies. I believe the pressure is something we haven't seen. The organizations like Stop Funding Hate, Hope Not Hate, and now Ripples, what are they leveraging against these companies that we don't know about? What's the correspondence that's going backwards and forwards? I think it's threats of direct action, like we see with Extinction Rebellion smashing windows of corporate properties. I think there's a little bit the whiff of the protection racket going on. So that's what I think's happening. As for GB News, it's been successful because it is finding a market, it's finding an audience, and that's what the market will bear. But for some people, I think people on the left and on the right who are a bit more authoritarian and controlling, they don't like seeing competition. They like one narrative, and you must stick to that narrative. And if you're watching somebody else's narrative, or you're watching multiple narratives and different perspectives, and getting a more rounded and balanced and realistic view of the world, we can't have that. You have to stick to the ideology. And on that note, I will see you another time. Say goodnight, cats.